So today's August 24th, which means that Ukraine and Russia have now been at war for 6 months. 6 months since Russia rolled its tanks and four major axes into Ukraine in a war that many people, including apparently the Russians, but also a fair number of outside experts, thought would be over within a few days. And here we are 6 months in. So I'm going to try in this Ukraine explainer to capture sort of where we've been and where maybe we're going. Well, where have we been? There was a run up to this war. American intelligence sources pointing to Russian preparations said they're going to attack. But many of us couldn't believe that Russia was going to attack because it just made no sense. But of course, they did. So a lot of people were caught off guard. Ukraine, in many respects, was caught off guard. But in some respects, too, Russia was caught off guard, even though it was its decision. I think the decision was so closely held inside the Putin administration that the army, while it was prepared in one sense, it had stockpiled all this equipment, it wasn't actually prepared to run into any resistance. And so fairly quickly, along these four axes, three of them made very little progress right out of the gate. There were some real major disasters in some places, especially north of Kiev, where this column of Russian tanks bogged down and then just became sitting ducks. But of course, across southern Ukraine, along the northern coast of the Black Sea, Russia captured quite a bit of territory. And that's important to note because I think if you had gone back to, before February of 2022 and said, what would Russia want to accomplish in Ukraine? You would have said what they want to accomplish is to capture a whole bunch of territory along the north coast of the Black Sea. And so in the context of this massive invasion of February 2022, we have this clear sense that Russia's failed and failed miserably. But there's another context in which this doesn't seem like such a disaster for Russia. And I think that's important to keep in mind. So essentially what happened, just to recap, is attack along four axes. Three of them, not too much happened. Kiev, they really had to pull back. Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city in the far northeast, Russia shelled with massive amounts of artillery. That was where the real destruction was in the first couple of weeks, but could never really break through. The third axis was in Donbass, where they'd been fighting for 8 years, and that's where the Ukrainians were most dug in and most ready, and so they didn't make much progress there either. But they did make progress in the south. After about 6 or 8 weeks of that, they said, okay, this isn't going so well. And instead of continuing along four axes, they really tried to hold their territory in the south. They abandoned Kiev, abandoned Kharkiv, and instead put all of their emphasis in Donbass. And over the sort of weeks of the late spring, early summer, through massively destructive tactics, huge bombardments, urban warfare that was very costly, they took some important cities so that they now control all of the territory of Luhansk Oblast or Luhansk region in Ukraine. So some more gains for Russia to the point where, as of a couple of months ago, Russia controls roughly 20% of Ukraine's territory. That came at a very high cost, though, in terms of personnel for both sides. So the situation we now face in the summer of 2022, 6 months in, is that Russia's taken a bunch of territory, but clearly not as much as it would like. And it's going to struggle to take more because it doesn't have the personnel to really drive a new major offensive. At the same time, Ukraine is eager to take back territory, especially in Kherson Oblast. It's a little bit of territory on the west bank of the Dnipro River, which is a very big river flowing south. It starts up in the marshes up near Belarus, but it flows down through Kiev and all the way down into the Black Sea. Russia has just a toehold on the west bank of that, and the Ukrainians want to push them out for strategic reasons. That kind of seems to be where the next big battle is going to be. What is unclear is whether either side at this point can muster enough troops, and especially well-trained, disciplined troops, to get the kind of local advantage they need to push anybody else. The military planners will tell you, it's just a rule of thumb, of course, but it's a pretty reasonable rule of thumb, that you need a 3-to-1 advantage in attackers to defenders in order for attackers to be able to displace defenders. And there's a real question at this point as to either side can achieve that on any but the most local scale. So where is this headed then? It seems like it's headed to a sort of stalemate, where both sides are very willing to keep fighting, but neither of them seems to be in a condition right now to dramatically change the lines of control. Strategically, this is going to be about the ability to endure, and in this, Russia's advantages are it's got a big economy and a big population compared to Ukraine, roughly 3 times the population. It's got a big military, lots and lots of military supplies in some respects, although they're running short of other things. They've survived the first round of sanctions, and in many respects, while the war is probably inconveniencing people, it's not really, of course, been brought home to the average Russian in the sense that Russia's not being attacked. There's been some notable Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, but most of Russia itself goes on with daily life. So those are the advantages Russia has. Ukraine has the advantage of if Russia can go on because most of Russia is not affected, Ukraine is profoundly affected, and of course that's its weakness. But in terms of the morale to fight, that's also its strength. So Ukraine has this incredibly high level of determination, morale to fight, and of course the support of the West in terms of armaments and weapons. As I said, unless something dramatically changes, neither side at this point seems to have the capacity to be able to bring either a significant number of more troops or weapons to be able to change the balance of power in the field. At the same time, neither side looks like it's anywhere near giving up or collapsing. So that's why this looks like it's going to sort of transform into a long, grinding war of attrition. Well, what could change that? Do sanctions begin to bite on Russia in a way that either really gets the Russian people irate and itching for the war to stop, or in a way that makes it hard to prosecute the war because of problems with the Russian economy? I would not hold my breath waiting for that to happen. Some kinds of sanctions are definitely having an impact, but at the same time, especially in oil, while Russia is struggling to sell oil, selling less oil, the price has gone up so much around the world that it's actually making more money selling oil than it was before the war. So in that respect, sanctions have very much backfired. Another big question is how Europe is going to handle gas shortages through the rest of this year and especially next winter. And how does that affect Europe's willingness to continue to support Ukraine? I think Russia's strategy is, we'll see how gung-ho the Europeans are when it starts getting cold and when they have to start shuttering their factories in order to keep their homes warm. I think the Russian belief is at that point there will be a lot of pressure on Ukraine to settle this conflict on Russian terms. We'll see about that. I think in the longer term, Russia is still betting that the West will just simply lose interest, and we'll have to see if that happens. My best guess is that, again, absent some dramatic change, this will drag on for some time. And I would point out, a lot of people think, well, this is grinding down. It's time to talk peace. I don't see either side having any interest in talking peace at this point. I would point out that the war in Donbass, which a lot of us didn't pay attention to, but was still a serious war, went on at a fairly low level from 2014 to 2022. I would also point out that Russia had put troops in Moldova in 1992, and they're still there. Russia intervened in Georgia in 1992, and they're still there. None of those conflicts ever got to the point of a peace treaty. Russia was very content to sort of let them simmer because they saw that as being advantageous. And my guess is that'll be the Russian strategy. Even if they can't take more territory, they'll say, okay, we'll wait. We'll wait till the West gets tired, or till Ukraine gets tired, or till we get a more pro-Russian government in Ukraine, or until we can build our military back up and we go again. So I think that's probably what the strategy is, what the prospects are. Let me try to step back and look at the big picture. What have we learned in 6 months of war? Well, the first thing we've learned is that Russia is not the country we thought it was. Even people like me who were pretty cynical and pretty worried about what Russia might do did not think that it was going to do this. I did a video back in the spring about is Russia fascist? That's a question that most of us would not have thought of asking 8 months ago. But the level of brutality in this war And the language, it's not just what's happening on the battlefield, the language of the Russian cheerleaders for this war is, for lack of a better term, bloodthirsty, genocidal. It's about wiping Ukraine off the map, about ending the very notion of an independent Ukrainian nation. So what kind of country is Russia now? Well, I think we're still trying to figure that out, because we're trying to figure out of this bloodlust that we seem to see from Russia right now, how much of it is temporary, how much of it is just a fixture of Putin, and how much of it goes much, 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 much deeper in society. At the same time, I think it's worth pointing out that Ukraine is not the country that we thought it was. People didn't think that the Ukrainian people would necessarily fight, and they didn't think that the Ukrainian government could get its act together. And in fact, in many ways, of course, Ukraine has been fought really inspirationally. And so the Russians definitely did not understand what kind of country Ukraine is, but nor I think did a lot of people in the West. So I think the other thing we've learned, and I haven't really seen the research come out on this yet, but I imagine people are writing the books on this right now, which is sanctions did not have the effect that we thought they would. Prior to this war, the question was not, would these kinds of sanctions have a big effect? The question was, would the West have the will to enact these kind of sanctions? But we sort of took it for granted that if the West got together on some of these really far-reaching sanctions, especially the financial sanctions, that it would bring Russia to its knees fairly quickly. And we were amazed, I think, both by how quickly the West did come together, and that was a function of the brutality of the war. But we've also been surprised that they've not really had the kind of impact on Russia that we thought they might. So that's something else we've learned. I guess the last thing I would say, this isn't really exactly something that we've learned, but it's something we need to, just to recognize, is that, we're in a very different world. We've learned, I guess, that the world we thought we were living in is not the world that we're living in. I like to think about historical analogies, as dangerous as that is, but I think it helps for non-specialists to sort of try to put some of this in context, and hopefully these analogies will enlighten more than they distort. But in terms of the war, I always think, well, and I said this a few months ago, which is I sort of said we're in the fall of 1914, World War I. Well, now I would say we're just about to Christmas 1914. And what I mean by that is when everybody went to war in the fall of 1914, they were gung-ho. It's like, yes, we have to get off to war. These poor young Englishmen, German Frenchmen saying, we've got to get off to war quickly before it ends because we don't want to miss the glory. And of course, it bogged down, and then they spent the next 4 years really in this horrendous trench warfare with people trying to get enough of an advantage to break through. I don't think that's going to happen in Ukraine on the scale that we saw in 1914, but I think we're to that point in the sense of the original rush of enthusiasm on both sides is now giving way to the reality that this is going to be a long slog, and that either side now, if it's going to try to take or retake territory, is likely to do so at very high cost, and we'll have to see at what effect. The other historical analogy I would think is not a military analogy, but it's a diplomatic analogy, and this is especially true, I think, for the West, and that's 1946. 1945, World War II ended. We had been allies with the Soviet Union during the war. And after the war, the Soviet Union, started really in very forceful ways taking control of Eastern Europe. The U.S. had hoped, World War II's over, Poland will get to be free again, Czechoslovakia will get to be free again, Hungary will get to be free again. The Soviet Union, led by Stalin, said, not so much, right? We're taking over. And there were big debates in the West, right? Is the way to deal with the Soviet Union to confront them? Or is it to recognize how devastated they were by World War II, how afraid they are of the West's superior might, and we basically need to placate them because if they're less afraid, they'll be less aggressive. And I think we're kind of having these discussions now where people are thinking, how do we handle Russia? And the reason I think about 1946 is that by the end of 1946, or certainly by the end of 1948, much of the West had congealed around this notion of containment. The idea that we can't stop Russia from doing certain things, but that we are going to need to really gird ourselves against Russia, against the Soviet Union, for a very, very long time. And as I read what various specialists in the West are saying now, I sense this similar thing, and that slowly but surely, people are coming around to the idea that this is not just a war that's going to end in 6 months or even a year. And when it's over, we're not going to have peace in the sense of peace, love, and understanding. If we get peace, it's going to be peace in the sense of we're not actively at war, but we're still in a very, very conflictual situation. And, I always counsel against telling the future too much, but it seems from where we're standing now that this sort of new confrontation between the West and Russia might go on as long as the Cold War did. And the Cold War, I always ended sort of miraculously, and that's where I'm going to wind up today, which is today, August 24th. It's not just the 6-month anniversary of this invasion; it's the 31st anniversary of Ukraine's independence and of the independence of a lot of the other post-Soviet republics that declared their independence at the time of sort of the coup against Gorbachev in Moscow in 1991. And so for Ukrainians, this is a very big day, but it's also a reminder that there were a set of events that led to the end of that previous era of massive confrontation. And one of the things that's interesting, of course, is that for some generations, my generation, Putin's generation, Putin sees that, of course, that experience of 1991 or of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 as something to be avoided in the future at all costs. So I say that because my fear is that the sort of miraculous end that we got to the Cold War might not be on the table this time, because I think Russia is going to be very much on the defense against it in a way that it wasn't in 1991. So sorry, not too cheerful, although I will say to my Ukrainian friends out there, happy Independence Day. Hopefully it doesn't involve too much Russian fireworks.